how you actually do your day-to-day writing. Then theming Sphinx, which is a question lots of people often have, and then how to build and host a Sphinx project. First, just a really quick intro on me. I'm the Director of Training, Documentation, and Community at Cybereason. I've worked in various related roles in the area over the last 20 years, and by happenstance often focused on sort of content management and learning management technologies. I first used Sphinx at edX back in 2013. It's been 5 years now. There are also a few other people from edX here who actually made the Sphinx projects work, so thank you for coming. Since then, I've built some Sphinx-based solutions at a couple other companies, the most recent being Cybereason, where I'm working now. I also teach a class called Tools and Technologies for Technical Writers at Middlesex College, and Sphinx is about a third of that course, maybe a quarter of that course. E-publications, Kindle books, and the list goes on and on. It's capable of generating content in more deliverable formats than any of us would use in one job. Sphinx is an open source system, which means it's free. It means it evolves very quickly. There's contributions to Sphinx from around the world with dozens and dozens of people. New releases happen all the time. It's free to get them. It's free to request new features or even contribute your own enhancements if you feel they're needed. Sphinx was first released in 2008, so it's actually on the email list. They were citing the 10-year anniversary of releasing Sphinx this month. Sphinx originated in the Python community as a way to generate developer documentation for Python projects. I'm not going to dive too deeply into that today, but one of the strengths of Sphinx is the ability to pull doc strings from code in Python modules to produce very rich, high-quality developer documentation or API documentation. While it originated in Python, it supports multiple languages, Java, C++, lots and lots of others. Speaking very literally, Sphinx is an extensible Python package. It's just a collection of code files written in Python that you can use just through the command line to create all these documents. So typically you install Sphinx, you use it from the command line, but you're not interacting directly with those Sphinx packages, and I'll show that in a bit. Some examples of Sphinx websites. These are linked in here, but let me just switch to the browser for a minute. Partly what I want to show is a handful of examples of different types of documentation that were all produced in Sphinx, and part of my goal in that is to show how different they are, how Sphinx is independent of theming or look and feel, and how extensible and customizable it is. The first example is a document from edX, which several of us in here have worked on in the past. It's basically, a very familiar layout for documentation with a TOC on the left, an index file, and you can drill down into it to different content. There's links and images and videos, fairly straightforward stuff. Amazon Web Services, for anyone familiar with that, most, if not all by now, their documentation is done through Sphinx. They've customized it a good bit more, but if you go to AWS documentation and drill down into that, there's lots of examples in here of Sphinx projects that they work on. Again, they have a similar layout with a TOC and your main content pane, but they've also done some more interesting things with that. In some cases, they have Kindle books that are produced through Sphinx, linked to this documentation as well. Probably my model for a lot of the documentation we do today is the MongoDB documentation, which is all done through Sphinx. They've customized it to a good degree. They're keeping some of the main themes with the TOC and content panes, but especially on the theming side, they've done a lot of customization. This is developer doc with a lot of code examples. And I'll show some more examples in a minute. And again, interrupt me anytime if you want more details about that. Basically, Sphinx, if you do a Sphinx project or a documentation project in Sphinx with the goal of producing a website, a static website out of it, or PDF file or Kindle book or other deliverable, there's a lot of flexibility in how you do that, but there is some common elements that every Sphinx project will have. And I'll look at these live in a second, but all the configuration for your Sphinx project is done through, it's always called the conf.py file. It's a Python file where you specify everything from the project name to the theme to use to any customization that you want to do in the project. Every project has to have an index file, which is your main landing page for the document, and that includes a map to all the other content. In my class, we talk about Ditto a lot too, and I associate the index file in a Sphinx project to a Ditto map. If you're familiar with writing in a Ditto environment, it's the same idea where it maps all your content. Your Sphinx project would include any other RST files, which are the actual content, the markup, in image files for content, or any other supporting files like video files and such. And then there's always a make file, which is simply the commands to build a website, a PDF file, ebook, or anything else you're working with. I won't run through it here because it takes a minute or so to watch the command window churn, but all that is, when you install Sphinx, all that is available out of the box. There's just a command to create a new Sphinx project where it gives you the skeleton and lets you start writing immediately. So I wanted to just quickly show these files in a text editor with Sphinx. So a conf file, again, there's a lot in here that's put automatically. I just wanted to know, like, things like the theme
Mark?
Are identified in here? Yes.
Were you going to show us that, or?
It's on my, I'm sorry, it's on my laptop. I thought it was mirrored here. I should look up at the screen a little more. Okay. So what I actually have open here in Sublime, which I'll just stop for a second, because it's a question I get asked a lot. Like, how do you edit a Sphinx project? It's all just text-based, which means you can essentially use any editor you like. I think Sublime is a common choice, but there's dozens, if not hundreds, of others. One thing I consider a plus on it, depends on your perspective, is it doesn't require a specific software installation like FrameMaker or Microsoft Word or desktop publishing tools like that. You can work with the Sphinx project in any environment that suits you. Sublime is, lends itself to it, to me, very easily, but again, that's a choice. I have open here a conf file. Again, this is Python code that's generated automatically when you create a Sphinx project. You don't need to touch this very often. Some things to note are, you add a project name, copyright and author name. It can add a Google Analytics ID and it tags the site automatically. One of the things I would highlight is you basically select a theme, and I'll get into theming in a minute, but there are many themes that are out of the box, or you can create your own, which defines all the styles, the layout of the project. An index file, let me find the right one, is just another text file, and it's laying out the structure of your document. So this, actually I should show this in HTML first for a second, it'll make more sense. This is a Sphinx project that I work on and off just about Sphinx and RST. It's one of those things that sits on my to-do list more than it gets done. But you can see here, this is the main landing page with basically a table of contents at the beginning. And I'm showing this in order to map this to what it actually looks like in my index file. If I open the index file, I see a Get Started section, and I'm going to dive a little more into the RST part. And I see a command called TOC tree. If you're familiar with DITA, I mentally map this to what a DITA map is, or a topic ref in DITA. It's just saying this is the structure of the document I want to produce. And I have some topics below that. I try to map that mentally to my website, that it comes out like this, and I can drill into any sections of this website and go back to the TOC if I need more help, and the other controls are part of the theme, which I'll get to. Other RST files, let me show just an example. RST file, again, is just plain text in an RST markup, which I'll go into a little more detail in a second. But this is straight text. There's no compiling. There's no sort of desktop publishing aspect to it. Formatting's controlled just by characters that you add to the text strings. And I will dive into that in 1 second. But any questions so far? Does it make sense? Okay. Let me keep moving. So what is RST? And I'm switching back and forth between actually showing RST and talking about it. And I'll get back to showing it. But RST is basically a markup language that is very lightweight and unobtrusive, at least ideally. And if you're familiar with Markdown, it's very similar. It evolved from Markdown. There's just a few extra commands and what in the RST world they call directives, which I'll look at, that text. It is editor independent. Like I said, I'm working in Sublime, but I could open these same files and get a totally different view or customize my own view in any way that, on any operating system that I like. So some very basic RST syntax, and I'll relate this back to the file I was showing, is that a simple paragraph is just a simple paragraph in your text markup. RST respects line breaks, spacing, indentation, etc. If you want text to be bold, it's just symbolized with the two asterisks around whatever you want to bold. It comes out that way typically in your theme. Italics is just one asterisk. Code text is the apostrophe symbol. List items are just asterisks, and numbered items are just the pound sign. I mean, that's 80% of, at least where I work now, and I think in some past jobs, what the writing activities involve is just this table. There's lots and lots of other options, but this is the bulk of our writers' daily work. And again, this is RST, and Sphinx is a processing engine, recognizes this markup to produce the expected results in your HTML or PDF file. A question I sometimes get in my class is, well, what if you want to change that or change the meaning of the double asterisk for bold. That's fine, but that happens through the theme layer. Like if you wanted bold, what is marked as bold, say in HTML text, or it would be marked with a strong tag, it's still going to be marked as the strong tag in your HTML that is generated from Sphinx, but how that's actually displayed in a browser is up to the theme or the CSS or styling code. Independent, in other words. Headings are, at first, a very sort of strange, confusing issue in Sphinx, but after a while you get used to it and it makes sense. You tell Sphinx to make headings or a hierarchy in a topic or a document simply by putting characters underneath what you want to be a heading. And it sounds not very modern in some ways, but it actually works out very easily and quickly once you get used to it, especially if you sort of invest in customizing an editor to do some of that automatically. In this example, pound signs under the heading make it an H1. The asterisks make it an H2, and equal signs make it an H3. I always stick to that as just a standard because it makes my life much easier. In the environments I've worked in, that's been a standard, and but that's actually not a hard-coded standard. I could reverse those. I could use any other symbols, and Sphinx would process it correctly as long as I am consistent. Like I can't use in one file in a project one symbol for a heading, and another file use another symbol. It confuses Sphinx. But if you're consistent, Sphinx reads all your files, it parses them, and it figures out your intention based on a hierarchy. Does that make sense? That's always like a sticking point when somebody's new to Sphinx. Yeah?
Do you need that many concepts?
Sphinx is very finicky, so as long as it goes past the heading, it's fine. I'm not defending this, actually. It's just sort of the way it is. But if I make it like this, I'll get an error because Sphinx is a processing engine, wants to be 100% sure it was intended as a heading. So if it's shorter, it'll flag it as a warning when you build the website. But as long as it's longer. So I often just make it a lot longer, so if I edit the title, I don't have to worry about it. And actually, like, if you do this full time, you probably want to add some shortcuts in your editor to say, make this an H1, and it just does it. If you're typing it by hand in Notepad, you just want to make sure it's longer. Again, that's sort of a legacy going back to 2008. It's a little strange, but it works after a while. I'll just add here, the nice thing about Sphinx is, if I'm working on something all day, I'm constantly building the website that results from the Sphinx project. It only takes a second, well, that's an exaggeration. It takes maybe a minute to build a big project, but it'll give you warnings, every little thing that might be off, like if the symbols you're using in headings aren't right or aren't spaced correctly, or if some syntax doesn't make sense. So a good best practice for a team that's working on big documentation is build often and fix the warnings right then. The risk, and I was having this conversation today at work, the risk is like you do lots and lots of work and write pages and pages of text and never build it. You're going to get to the end of the project and build it and discover there's 20 warnings, and you have to go back and find them all, and it can be challenging to reverse engineer stuff. But if you just do it all the time, and there's actually a built-in facility as Sphinx where it just sort of, every time you save a file, it just builds automatically, and you can check it.
And are the warnings like specific, or are they kind of like vague of like, okay, there's a problem with this line?
It really depends. It really depends on what it is. I think it's improved in other releases. Sometimes you get a warning that doesn't make any sense. So for common errors like this, it'll tell you exactly the line number and what's wrong, and then it's pretty easy to go fix. But like any big software program, some warnings are not that opaque. But the nice thing about, sorry, I don't know what just happened. The nice thing about an open source program is you Google any of those error messages, you'll get a ton of stuff. There's a pretty active Sphinx community on Stack Exchange, and I can't think of many cases where I really have not been able to figure out what the issue was. The other big thing, and this is a little hard to read, but I'll show some examples, are the idea of directives in RST. And directives are simply commands that you put in the text to tell the Sphinx as it processes the text to do something special with that. So some of the most common examples are if you want something to be formatted as a note or a warning, you might, in your style guidelines and branding guidelines, have certain imagery that goes along with that, or want warnings to appear in red, or whatever the case may be. You add the command, or in RST language, the directive, and you simply add two, and then the command name, like here the command is warning, and then I can write my warning however I want. If I want to wrap certain text in a website in a specific CSS class to provide formatting for that, I can simply use the class command and name the class. I'll show some examples of that. The nice thing about Sphinx is, out of the box, there are dozens and dozens of these, which are 99% of what you would ever need. But as an open source system, you can create your own directives if you want to do something special or unique in your documentation, and you can add it just to your installation of Sphinx, or if it might have larger interest, you can contribute it back to the open source community. Let me show some examples of that, but does that make sense in general? Okay, let me look back at some examples here. So I'm just looking at one topic in my document. Again, you can see the headings. I'm using the pound sign as heading 1. I'm very consistent about that. This syntax, I didn't call this out in the presentation, but just the name and surrounded by the single quotations and the underscore basically becomes a link in my HTML to each of these subsections here. See, and as long as it matches the text, this works. So install Sublime, links to this section, and so on. I can see the results of this. I'm looking for the right page in HTML. My system. So this is translating just this mini table of contents at the top of the page. Some other things I'd highlight in the RST file. There's links. There are different ways to do links, but I'm basically saying in this sentence, get Sublime from the Sublime website. I have a link defined elsewhere in the project. Let me find it. Here we go. This is simply a record of the link, and the reason it's separated out is I can use that in any page or any project and maintain it once, and use it across projects or use it in this project and not have to worry about maintaining multiple files. And that just uses this xref in colons here, followed by the name of the link. An example of the directives I was showing is this directive here called YouTube. It's just simply ... YouTube : and this is the YouTube ID. And part of the Sphinx processor is going and finding that video, getting the embed code, and putting it right in my document. So here is that video. And all I really need to do is enter the command and the video ID. I have some numbered steps here that translate to numbered steps in my document. Again, I just use the pound sign. It keeps track of the numbering for me. Comes out down here, and it keeps the indentation well. One thing I'd note about RST is unlike some programs or like writing in XML, RST adheres to indentation, and that's because it really evolved from the Python community, where in Python programming, indentation has a lot of meaning as opposed to some other programming languages. So the fact that I have sentences here embedded under a step is coming from the fact that I have those sentences indented under my numbered step in the RST. In the interest of time, let me move on, but I'm happy to go over any more RST pieces. Code blocks are a very common piece of Sphinx documentation. So let me just look at files. So to have text formatted as code blocks, this is a little misleading because I'm including another file, but one nice thing about Sphinx is right here, see, I'm specifying RST as the code block language here, but it supports any programming language from Python, Ruby, Java, XML. And what that does is color code the actual text, the code block example, in a way that programmers or users would be familiar with. So let me actually find an example here. So this is all these shaded areas are how the theme chooses to format code blocks. And you can see these aren't like the richest examples, but these are color-coded in ways that make it reasonable. There's also the ability to do these tabs for different languages. I can see a JSON, Python, or Ruby example, and you can extend that to any language. It supports pretty much any language you can think of. Let me keep moving on unless there are questions. So theming is a big issue in Sphinx, and very much like DIT or XML languages, how your project is output and how it looks is completely independent of what's in the project. Like none of the style guidelines were actually in the RST files I was working with. So when Sphinx processes your RST content, it goes through an engine and it applies a certain theme to it. And there are dozens of themes that are out of the box. You can customize them. You can make your own. Some of the big companies I looked at, like Amazon and MongoDB, will customize their own themes to adhere to their brands. edX, the example I showed at the beginning, did some light customization where it has the right logo, et cetera. But there's really no limit to how much time you can put into that. Let me show, I don't want to actually run it because it'll take a few minutes, but I'm looking at one version of the document here, and this is a document I was working on. This is the Bootstrap theme, which is an out-of-the-box theme. I didn't touch anything on it. I just told it to use it. Here's the same document in another theme called a go-go. I don't even know where it comes from, but it's just built in the system. Looks completely different. And then a default theme, or what Sphinx calls their default, ends up like this. And if you look at a lot of Python developer documentation on the web, it looks very much like this, because a lot of people don't have need to do any customization. They just want to get some open source project documentation up. Again, what I want to emphasize is this is all the exact same Sphinx project content. The only difference is one line in that configuration file. I just said, use this theme. I rebuilt it. I switched the themes. I rebuilt it again, saved it off. So how far you want to take that, how much customization you want to do is totally up to you. Finally, building a project. Again, I'm not going to do this in real time, but once you install Sphinx and you create a project, building the HTML is as simple as going to a command line and typing make HTML, and it's going to, based on your configuration file, it's going to make a static website based on that content. The ones we were just looking at are just on my desktop. I did exactly that. Then finally, hosting Sphinx projects. Like where I'm working now, we just take that static HTML and put on a protected website for our customers. It's not open to the world, so we have to manage that ourselves. But if you're dealing with something that is open to the world, a lot of people use a service called readthedocs.org, where if you have your Sphinx project stored in GitHub or Bitbucket or another open or internet accessible location, you simply go into readthedocs.org and you can create a project and you point it towards where your Sphinx project is on the web, and it just creates your website automatically, as well as updates your website automatically when you make changes to the Sphinx project. Some advantages, and I'd say I love Sphinx. I wouldn't use anything else in my job today. Some people agree, some don't. A common experience I have with some new writers who've joined us, or even in the class at Middlesex I teach, is like people don't like it in the first couple weeks, and it seems a little confusing or like more work. And then a common experience is after a couple weeks, a light bulb sort of goes off, and you're like, oh, this is actually very easy. It's very lightweight. I can customize my editor however I want. And I think in the medium and long term, it speeds up a lot of content development, especially when you're working with big teams. Another advantage is that it's extensible. If it's not capable of doing something you want, and that something is valuable to you, it's a fairly easy lift to create an extension to do that. An example that we're investigating at work, and it hasn't been delivered yet, but you saw the YouTube directive in there. That's part of Sphinx now. I can just add a YouTube ID. We actually don't host our videos on YouTube. We host them on Wistia. We'd like to be able to do the same thing with Wistia. Instead of having to go get complicated embed code, we just want to be able to put the ID in and let Sphinx generate what it has to. We're talking about, do we want to actually build a Sphinx extension to do that, and would it be valuable to other people besides ourselves, and can we contribute that back to the world? So it's a cost-benefit decision at that point. But there's many extensions available in the open source world. If you just Google Sphinx, what you need to do, you can find dozens, and it's often the case that somebody solved the problem that you're working on already, and you can simply download their extension and use it. You can customize the output in any way you want. Again, it's a cost-benefit analysis, how customized you want your website or other deliverables to be. You don't need to do any of it. You can do it out of the box very quickly. But if you have big branding needs, it's useful. Something that's the last thing I'll say is a big advantage that we're actually just taking advantage of at Cybereason right now is the translation management. So we're working with translators to provide Japanese documentation in Sphinx right now, and it is the most efficient process I've ever seen. There's a command in Sphinx that says to generate translation files that you then deliver to the translators, and those files don't have all the RST markup, and it doesn't have all the other Sphinx pieces. It's just a collection of English strings and Japanese strings, English strings, Japanese strings. They translate the strings right in that. We put it back in the project. We don't have to create duplicate Japanese or any other language RST files. We just say build it in Japanese, and Sphinx pulls the right language into whatever we're delivering. So that's a very brief overview of something that it is, in fact, a little more complex, but it is a big advantage that we're taking it, we're leveraging right now. I'll share this on the Slack channel, but I have some links in here to this actual Sphinx documentation. Read the docs website where you can publish Sphinx projects, a list of available Sphinx extensions, RST primer, and the work in progress Sphinx RST guide that is out there, which is in fact open source, and anybody can do anything they want with it, actually. Contribute to it or steal it or anything else. So that's it. I hope I didn't go too far over time, but any questions or anything anyone wanted to see?
Can you show us the translation? Anything that you can show us in regards to the translation, please?
Sure. Let me, this is all classified information, but I'll show it briefly. I guess this will be on video, but that's okay. So I'm going to actually look at my product documentation. So okay, so this is a little dense, but basically this is what they call a PO file for an RST file, which you see here for each string there's a English string and then the Japanese string, and it gets a little more complicated in some examples. But what this shows is this string has been translated in this Japanese. And when I build the project, if I say just build in Japanese, when it gets to this string in the document, it's just going to replace it with the Japanese content. But this is the only file the translator has to work with. And it can be loaded into their own translation memory system to automate it more and integrate it with their translation memory system. And this is actually a common way of doing it with Python projects. So a lot of translation vendors already have integration set up with PO files in their translation memory, so it's very efficient. They don't have to reinvent the wheel for it. What's really nice about this is, we do a lot of new versions, and we have the Japanese strings from the last version, but there's a command in Sphinx to say, update these PO files, and it will flag every string that's changed, every string that hasn't, and it'll highlight those for the translators. So it shortens and eases the project instead of sending them a huge collection of files and not you know, and having them have to figure out what's new, what's not, pretty much does it for you. And we've just, over the last 3 or 4 months, gotten into a real rhythm of doing this every month almost. And then translating incremental changes becomes, I wouldn't say trivial, it depends how much writing we've done, but you don't run into all the tool issues that translators often have. All they're doing is giving you a text file back and forth. We're only doing this for Japanese, but it should scale to pretty much any language we would consider. I can show you, let me, I'll just do this briefly and show our documentation. So this is like our branded documentation done in Sphinx. It starts with a video and goes down into this. Let me see. Okay, here's the Japanese version. Sorry. Yeah, we're working on the translated transcript for the videos. But all they did to produce this is deliver a PO file where it just had English string, Japanese string next to it, and the generation process did the rest.
Is search built in?
Yeah, so there's a, let me go back to the English so I know what I'm searching. But the basic HTML themes, most of them will have the search right here. So they're, and it's all static. This is something we're actually talking about at work. So unlike having like an indexer for your website or something like Google, or I guess Google's not supporting the appliance that people would apply to these websites anymore, it's not dynamic, which means the index files that the search is working with are created at generation time. It's not perfect. Like long strings, it doesn't do well with, just because there's a limit to how much data it's going to generate behind the scenes when you build a project. But for simple strings, it's very quick. Like there's no server-side processing going on. And you get different results. Like right now, there's no facility to rank results. What's nice, this is a little feature of the theme, is if you started with a search, you know, that search term remains highlighted as you're going through documentation. Good questions. Bless you. Any other questions? Cool. Well, thank you. I'll share this in Slack, and you know, I'd love any thoughts about it or questions, or especially if you're trying to pursue a new project in Sphinx. I'm always interested in issues that come up.